How's it going, everyone? This is Boots with SnapKeep Arcade, back with another standard deck guide with Spencer Howland of Constructed Criticism. This week we'll be talking about Selesnya Tokens. Thanks for joining us, Spencer. Why don't you start by telling us the overall strategy of Selesnya Tokens?
Yeah, this deck is probably one of the more streamlined decks in the format. This deck is really just trying to gain a board advantage in different ways, whether it's going wide or making large creatures through Venerated Loxodon or attacking after a Flourish. You're really trying to overwhelm your opponent with a large board of creatures, either a lot of little creatures or some medium creatures all attacking at once.
Tell us about the creatures in the deck.
Yeah, so the creatures that we have in the main are 4 Adanto Vanguard, 3 Emmara the Soul Cord, 3 Tristani, 4 Venerated Loxodon, and then I would kind of categorize Legion's Landing as a creature. It makes a 1/1 and then flips. And History of Benalia kind of acts as a creature in the deck often as well, as does Saproling Migration. The difference is that Saproling Migration, March of the Multitudes, and all of those other cards that we just mentioned can make multiple creatures, which is kind of different than other decks that you might play, where when you play a 2/2, you get a 2/2, but here, when you play History of Benalia, you get 2 2/2s that become much larger later. There are a couple of key creatures in this deck, and we'll kind of start with like the things that make your things bigger. So Tristani and Venerated Loxodon act as opportunities for you to, if you play something like an Adanto Vanguard or a Emmara, you can make them a little bit larger with your Venerated Loxodon or your Tristani. So one of the things that this deck is good at, right, is making lots of creatures. But the problem is that you have to find a way to make it so that those creatures can attack in the mid game, when your opponent is playing 3/3s and things like that. And these cards as well kind of serve that role along with Ajani as an opportunity to make your creatures a little bit larger. The other things you have are kind of your aggressive cards. So, you have things like your Adanto Vanguard is going to be able to attack really often, getting your opponent's life total small enough that when you draw something like a Flourish and you can flourish on the back end, their life total is small enough that you can get all those 3/3s in and, deal them the last points of lethal damage in big chunks. Then you kind of have a couple of weird cards in the creature slot. So for example, Emmara is pretty interesting, but she's much better in certain matchups where Conclave Tribunal is good, or where the 1/1 matters, or in matchups where she can attack freely. So she's pretty good against control because when she attacks, you just get a free 1/1. And if she gets to attack multiple times, she's generating a lot of value over the game. Whereas if you look at something like Mono Red, it's really hard for just a plain old 2/2 to get in there profitably. So she's very matchup dependent compared to your other creatures.
Let's talk about Ajani.
Yeah, so Ajani is one that is pretty interesting. So Ajani can get back Adanto Vanguard or Emmara, kind of letting him play that mid game that we're talking about. His ability to minus to get creatures, specifically those 2 creatures, or plus to make your creatures bigger, allows you to kind of manage that board that we're talking about. The whole point of this deck is to have a dominating board presence, and Ajani able to plus to make your board bigger, to basically put 2 power and 2 toughness into play, is really good.
Tell us about some of the other spells in Selesnya Tokens.
So March is kind of one of the key cards in this deck and one of the reasons the deck is good. The first March is always kind of medium, but if you ever get a March into a March, so you cast a March for 3 and then your next March is for 7, that's usually a good enough board advantage for you to cast Flourish on the Flourish side and win the game on the spot. So, at their end step, you make 3 tokens, and then again, you make 3 tokens, you say go, they have 1 chance to interact with you, and if they don't, they're probably dead. Just being able to make a massive army of 1/1 creatures that between, your Flourishes or your Tristani, things like that, you're able to really make huge creatures really quickly.
Let's go over the removal.
Yeah, one of the things you'll notice is the only actual interactive spell in this deck is 4 Conclave Tribunals. This means that you've got to be pretty selective on the type of things that you interact with. For example, killing a 2/2 early, it seems like a good idea, right? Because you can get in with your Saproling tokens, things like that. But it doesn't always work out like that, because once they play a 3/3, then you might not be able to attack again for the rest of the game. So you really have to be careful with how you use that card and understand what is the most important thing that's going to happen in this game and play accordingly with it.
The one of Arch of Orazca stands out to me. Why do we run it in the deck?
It's pretty easy for you to get 10 permanents in play. That's not really a problem. You have multiple cards that put multiple permanents into play. Legion's Landing puts multiple in play. History of Benalia puts multiple into play. Saproling Migration puts multiple into play. Emmara puts multiple into play. So it's really easy to get to 10. So that card, I'm sure every time you draw it, it's pretty easy to get active. One of the things that you want to be able to do in this deck is, generate advantage throughout every single turn of the game, even when you don't have spells. So Legion's Landing and Arch kind of do that together, as well as Ajani.
Do you have any tips and tricks with the deck?
Just the Conclave Tribunal and the double march thing, I think, is the most important thing. Understanding when to activate your Vanguard is also pretty important. I typically find that if I'm the beatdown and I can get advantage out of activating Vanguard, I'm going to do it every time. So for example, if I can attack with 3 creatures and flip my landing and one of them is a Vanguard, I'm probably just going to attack with all 3 creatures every time and activate it when they block. It doesn't really matter. You're going to be the beatdown most of the time. The decks that you aren't going to be the beatdown are typically matchups where Adanto Vanguard is bad anyway. So you're going to be boarding him out in those matchups, and you just kind of have to take stock of what that looks like.
Awesome. Let's go over the key matchups with the deck.
One of the reasons that this deck has started to do really well again is just kind of the fall of Goblin Chain Whirler in general. Like, that card just doesn't see the same amount of play it was seeing at the beginning of this format, or even just a couple of weeks ago. And because of that, you really get to play things like Legion's Landing, Adanto Vanguard, Saproling Migration without really fearing triple red coming down and crushing you. And that changes a lot of things. I typically have found that this deck's pretty weak to Jeskai control. I'm told that the deck is good against other mid-range decks. I've kind of been 50-50 in most of the other matchups with this deck. I think that you can beat Drakes. I think that you can beat Green-Black, and I think you're pretty bad to Jeskai, but I think you're really good against random other decks. I think that most decks aren't prepared for an onslaught of tokens, and so if you're not getting paired against one of the big 3 decks, you probably have a pretty good matchup. And then other than Jeskai, you have a pretty reasonable matchup with those decks. The thing is that with Jeskai control, the reason that they're good against you is because they get to play Drake and they get to play Deafening Clarion. You can find advantages against the other Drake decks, but Deafening Clarion kind of makes it really tough. One of the things that I've also noticed is that the best card in the Drake's deck against you now is the 1/5. Yeah, Murmuring Mystic is really good against you. Just being able to untap with that card has been really tough for me to beat, and so that's typically the card that I would save something like Conclave Tribunal for.
Let's talk about the sideboard.
The sideboard we have is 3 Baffling End, 2 Kraul Harpooner, 3 Knight of Autumn, 2 Ixalan's Binding, 1 Nullhide Ferox, 1 Shalai Voice of Plenty, 2 Vivien Reid, and 1 Immortal Sun. You'll notice something very important about this sideboard. We talked about how there's only 4 Conclave Tribunal for the most part as interactive spells in the main deck. As you'll notice, 3 Baffling End, those interact with your opponent, 2 Kraul Harpooner, those interact with your opponent, 3 Knight of Autumn, those interact with your opponent, 2 Ixalan's Binding, those interact with your opponent, 1 Shalai, that's an answer card to things that your opponent could be doing, such as Settle the Wreckage, 2 Vivien Reids, that's something that can interact with your opponent, 1 Immortal Sun, that's a direct interaction with your opponent's cards. So the way that the deck changes is it goes from being this all-out deck in game 1 into finding the pieces that it can disrupt its opponents in the best way possible, and then adjusting its game plan accordingly to fit those in. So something like Baffling End, instead of playing these Saproling Migrations against Mono Red, which seem like a good idea because token decks typically have a really good matchup against this, or maybe these Adanto Vanguards, you want those out. Maybe you bring in some Baffling End and some Kraul Harpooners and some Knight of Autumns instead, and kind of play the game as a bigger green control deck versus those aggro decks. Against something like Control, you react to them with your Vivien Reids and with Ixalan's Binding instead. So it really just depends on the matchup, and these sideboards are actually these are some of my favorite kind of sideboards where I get to pick and choose my interaction for certain matchups and then take out my bad cards. That's like the easiest way to sideboard, and it's really effective.
Tell us more about the Immortal Sun.
Yeah, so this card is for one purpose and one purpose only. So Planeswalkers can't activate loyalty abilities. So you'll notice that your deck only has Ajani, and there are going to be decks specifically. This card is actually kind of awkward because a lot of people really love it and a lot of people really hate it, but it's actually for Green-Black. So there are versions of Green-Black that play 2 Vraska, the little Vraska, 1 big Vraska, 3 Vivien Reid, right? And when you play against that deck, that's the kind of thing that their advantage might actually overwhelm your creature advantage eventually. And so if you can turn off half of their most important cards with something like the Immortal Sun, plus make all of your creatures bigger at the same time, right? It's going to be pretty effective in that matchup specifically.
Any final thoughts on Selesnya Tokens?
Yeah, I would just like to say, like, if you have different takes on this deck, I know that this deck is one of less explored decks in the format, right? So, with things like Golgari, Drakes, and Jeskai, they're very explored. Everyone's trying to find the best versions of them. So decks like this that are coming up and becoming better decks, this deck is one of the best performing decks in the last month. You can gain an advantage by figuring things out that people haven't figured out yet. So I do encourage people, if they like this style of deck, to try this one one out, because you're going to figure things out and you're going to gain an advantage from people not being prepared for you right now, because they're really preparing for those top 3 decks.
All right, Spencer, tell everyone where they can find your work.
First of all, just if you're watching on my channel, please head over to SnapKeep Arcade, hit their like, hit their sub button. Andrew does amazing work. We really appreciate doing these videos with him every week. If you haven't checked us out, Constructive Criticism, please do so. I do a podcast every week with the Hall of Famer Seth Manfield and Gold Pro John Starn, where we talk about getting better at Magic the Gathering with the focus on constructive play. And then there's an entire network over at constructivecriticism.com of different podcasts and videos that you can check out. So yeah, thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you so much to Spencer Howland of Constructed Criticism for another deck guide. If you like this video, please hit that like button. Make sure to subscribe to SnapKeep Arcade and hit that notification bell to get notified whenever we upload a new video. This has been Boots with SnapKeep Arcade. Thanks for watching.